order. You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Very little levity today. We're on a war footing as a country, and closer to home, the Children's Commissioner reports that only 1 in 8 cases of child sex abuse comes to light. I want to understand why, and I want your help in understanding why. And I know it will involve you looking into yourself and looking into your past and dragging up some of the most traumatic experiences any human being can endure. And I know that if you don't have any personal investment or indeed interest in this issue, the temptation now is to look away, to put your fingers in your ears, to do something else, to put on the hit parade. But we can't, because it's getting worse. And the only thing that's getting better is our ability to talk about it. And the more that we talk about these things, the more light we shine into the dark corners, the more children we will save. Don't do portentous self-congratulation. But on this issue, the more we talk about it, you and me, the more children will escape or avoid sex abuse. Full stop. End of. That's why I get so cross with people, some of whom come from a perfectly well-meaning perspective, but people who argue that you shouldn't be teaching children about what is and what is not appropriate behaviour as soon as they're old enough to understand. The only way you can minimise the likelihood of an adult doing something disgusting to them is if they have an inkling that it is disgusting. That's it. For me, at least. I'm sorry to sound so scorched earth on this, but I sometimes say to you, we're not going to have an argument about this. If you ring in to challenge what I've just said, I think we probably will. We probably will have an argument. But today's not the day for fights. Let's look at the numbers. Only 1 in 8 cases of child sex abuse is identified by the authorities. This is an official report. I don't understand the methodology of it. They will have extrapolated from a smaller sample a broader conclusion. So they'll have looked at, they'll have spoken to lots and lots of people, one imagines, and identified a relationship between the cases that have been reported and the cases that have not, and then they'll extrapolate from their sample something that represents the whole nation. So the Children's Commissioner for England, for example, found that there had been 50,000 reported cases of sex abuse over the last 2 years. Her estimate is that the true number will be around the 400 to 450,000 mark. It uses a tested statistical model which predicts unknown quantities. Abuse in the home, right? We probably knew this already, but it merits repetition. By parents, by siblings, by other relations, or by trusted family friends is a far, far greater problem than abuse by strangers, or, I suppose, given some of the conversations we've had in recent months, abuse by VIPs. It accounts for 2/3 of all cases. 2/3 of all cases of child sex abuse involve adults known to the victim. That's astonishing, really. And before I became a parent, I probably would have said, and I hope I wouldn't have done it in an insensitive way, I probably would have said it, I can't believe it. I mean, how can all of these children have been let down so badly by their own parent? How can they not? But the answer is, if the parent is undertaking the abuse, how the hell can the parent also be somehow responsible for giving the child what they need to recognise and report abuse? It gets less mysterious to me, this world, the more we discuss it. I will never, however much we discuss it, I don't think, be able to understand on the tiniest level how an adult can undertake this sort of behaviour. But all of the other issues, the secrecy, the failure to come forward, the shame, the manipulation, all of those become easier to understand the more that you discuss them. Anne Longfield is the Children's Commissioner for England. She has said today that children must be better equipped to act on the signs of child abuse. I want to ensure children have the confidence and resilience to understand healthy and safe relationships. Often they don't have the words to describe what's happening to them. And I think she's right. And I think that is an interesting debate. And I think I'm pretty much 115% on her side in it. But before that debate unfolds, you need to have a better understanding of how it can happen. How it can happen. Not the abuse, but the secrecy. And I can't really tell you that, but you possibly can tell us, can tell me. So why didn't what happened to you result in punishment or reporting for the person that did it to you? And I would love to hear your story. And I say that in full knowledge of how tough it will be for you to tell it, but also in passionate belief that what I just said about shining lights into dark corners and increasing understanding through familiarity is pretty much the only weapon we've got in this fight, you and I. I can't think of any others, really. Gus has been in touch to say just string them all up from the nearest lamppost. And I get that, of course, but you can't, especially if it's not being reported, Gus. That's kind of the point. These are children being abused by family members, and they're not telling anyone. And then when they do tell someone, they don't get believed. Now, it's horrible, but it's not that hard to understand when you think about it. Think about what you're feeling right now. Think about what you're feeling right now at this moment. You're thinking, I don't know if I can listen to this. Well, now imagine if someone had abused someone you know, and it was possible not to believe them. You know what I mean? You know when you don't want something to be true? The effort the human being can put into persuading themselves that something isn't true is immense. Absolutely immense. Our powers of self-delusion are epic, truly epic. And probably, I think we touched on this last week, didn't we? Probably part of the survival of the species. Otherwise, every time we were bereaved, every time something terrible happened, we'd lose the will to live. We have this astonishing ability to bounce back, almost to pretend that we're not mortal, almost to pretend that we're not vulnerable. And God forbid that anyone in your life has ever come to you and said that Uncle Ray or their teacher or the priest or their dad is doing horrible things to them, and you've been so desperate to believe it's not true, you've somehow managed to simultaneously close your eyes, block your ears, and persuade yourself that it isn't. Now, that's a charitable reading of it. The uncharitable reading, and God knows this goes on, the uncharitable reading is that you're saying disgusting things. This happened a lot in Ireland in the last century, saying disgusting things about the local priest, and you will be punished. This sort of fear, this religious fear that's instilled in so many of us when we're young, translates into really a free pass for abusers in some context, positions of authority. So, look, the question isn't overcomplicated, but my God, I know how hard it will be for you to answer. Why didn't your case of child sex abuse come to light? 0345 6060 973. And I'm going to do this. I'm going to go all in on this because I think the children deserve it. You tell me now why your case stayed secret, and you, in our tiny, tiny way, just increase the likelihood of the next case not staying secret. Just because people will recognise what you went through, and they will recognise what you describe, and they will recognise what you endured. And when they understand that they're not alone and that somebody else went through similar and somebody else arrived at the conclusion that they would come forward, having heard from you, then I don't think it's an exaggeration to suggest that's pretty much the most important conversation we will ever have on the radio. Phone lines are open. Be patient with us. We're a little short-staffed at the moment, but we will, I promise you, take every call that comes in. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And I get why, up to a point, the things stay secret. But I want to get beyond that point today, and I can only do that with your help. I'll go to Jacob in Islington first. And Jacob, rest assured that if we find ourselves running short of time for the travel news, there'll be plenty of time for you to come back afterwards. I don't want you to feel squeezed into any available slots, all right? What made you pick up the phone?
Well, I think it's pretty simple, really. I think the writing's on the wall. 7 out of 8 cases don't get reported. And I think from my experience, it comes down to humiliation and not knowing who to turn to. My first case wasn't so much abuse; it happened when I was at boarding school,
yes.
And again, I was so ashamed. I didn't know who to turn to. Yes, there's people there I could have gone to, but you just got to. I put my head in the sand and just pretend it wasn't happening and stuck it somewhere pretty secret.
Which is the common response, I think. It's far from rare.
Yeah. Look, I'm a pretty level-headed sort of person, and It's sort of had a bit of an effect on my life, but I think, I've stuck in a place where it's a lot easier for me to deal with and not think about. But I think that, I think the people who do these sort of things know that it's a sort of something that they can do to somebody else and get away with it, because I think if there's more places for these children to go to reveal these people who do these dreadful things to other people, I think they probably wouldn't do it as much.
What about the threat, though? I mean, I understand that you sort of compartmentalised it and tried to shut it down and keep it away. People listening will wonder why you couldn't tell your parents, or why you couldn't tell a trusted teacher what you were frightened of, apart from humiliation and shame.
I think from my point of view, as I say, it happened first time when I was 9.5 years old, and then it happened with a different situation, different person, a different environment, about 3.5 years later. And you just kind of feel, when it happened second time around, I felt like a marked person, that possibly there was a target or something written on my forehead that other people could see because of the secrecy and where I kept this place in a quiet place. I think the second person who came along and abused me, I think, took one look at it and went, oh, yes, this is, after sort of pushing the issue and finding whether they could get something out of me that satisfied them, that I think they can, I think to some extent they can see the people they know they can get away with it.
I've heard apocryphal reports of that, of even on the strength of a photograph of offenders identifying the one most likely to be a victim. And I mean, it beggars belief, really, but I suppose it's simply a question of manipulation, isn't it? So some people are more easily manipulated than others.
Yeah, and I think second time round it was it went on longer second time round than first time round for me. But I think, as I say, I think the person saw it, recognised it, realised I wasn't going to say anything, and went for it. And she was correct. Didn't do anything about it, and that happened in my home as I was growing up as a 10-year-old boy. I mean, she nailed it. Got away with it.
Have you reported it subsequently? Have you felt any desire to?
No, well, I'm in counselling about the whole thing, but I mean, I'm 43 years old, and all those times ago, and I mean, I have young children now, and I'm dreading the age that I've got a little boy who's 6. I'm dreading the age that he gets to when I first got abused, because I just think it's, I say I stuck in a place where it's easy for me to deal with.
But as your lad grows, it's going to be harder to keep the lid on it, isn't it?
I don't go down that road enough for it to sort of bother me. It has had some repercussions in the future for me, but But, when you then start living your life through your children's, you start living Christmas through your kids' lives, and that's all lovely and amazing. But my little boy gets to 9.5 years old, I'm going to have to go somewhere special to make sure that, I don't sort of relive those sort of issues that happened to me.
What sort of conversations do you have with him?
He's 6 now. I mean, it's all about just kick a football around.
Well, you know why I ask you, Jacob, because the Children's Commissioner is calling for lessons for 5-year-olds to prevent paedophilia in the family or in the context where you endured it, you suffered it.
Yeah, I mean, I heard your brief before about how when do you start having these conversations, and I mean, I think. Although some parents might say, "Oh, well, that's too early," but this. I mean, I think earlier the better. I think as you're installing, life lessons into your children, I think they get to know the wrongs and rights pretty early in life.
And they get less spooked and freaked and sort of, freaked out, for want of a better phrase. The younger they are, I find, the easier it is for them just to understand simple lessons, simple messages. Jacob, thank you. 18 minutes after 12 is the time, and there you go. That's how it happens. Fear of humiliation. Here's one. Response immediately while Jacob was talking. Humiliation is so right, James. My brothers would have sorted out the guy if I'd told. I was only 8. Why do you do it, James? Why do you return again and again to this subject? I'll tell you why. Because of this email right here from Gordon. Hi, James. I want to tell you, but I'm so ashamed, so I'm emailing. I was raped when I was 7. I went home afterwards and could only point to my rear to my mother. She promptly prescribed it as a bee sting I never tried to explain it to anyone else ever again, vowing to take it to my grave, and I nearly did. I became an alcoholic and a drug-dependent lost soul. I'm better now and have learnt how events like these scratch our childhoods. I'm now a counsellor and doing my Masters in Psychology with a focus on trauma. I want to tell you who it was, but I can't. But it was Stephen's dad. You may read and edit as much as you like. That's why. 7 years old. Frightened to tell. And when he tried, I don't know from that, do I, whether or not his mum was some way looking the other way, pretending it hadn't happened. But you don't get the help you need, and that's 7 out of 8 cases. 7 out of 8. And I don't think it's that hard to understand how it happens. Helen is in Hertfordshire. Helen, what would you like to say?
I'd just like to say that the reason that I didn't say anything as a 10-year-old was because I was living in a very difficult family situation. I didn't want to make that situation worse.
Gosh.
And as a 10-year-old, the decision you make is obviously very different to the decision that you make as an adult. I was frightened of not being believed, and I just didn't want to make the family situation worse.
And you knew it was wrong?
Yeah, I knew it was wrong, and it involved me and another very close family member who confided in me, and then when I said we should tell somebody, that person then didn't want to speak about it anymore, and it was not spoken about for about 16 years. I wasn't able to. I think your earlier caller, Jacob, said that he was able to put it out of his mind. I wasn't. It absolutely clouded every aspect of those 16 years. And then I got a phone call one day at work to say that the abuser had been arrested for abusing a friend of his daughter's, who was about the same age as we were at the time.
God.
I met face to face with the other person involved when we were children, because I was at work. It was difficult to talk about it, and we phoned Childline. Although we were adults, we just did not know what else to do. It was my absolute worst fear ever that somebody else would suffer, and it was just like a nightmare. And we went to the police, and we ended up going to court at the Old Bailey, which was very frightening.
Even as a grown-up, it was frightening because, of course, imagine what it would have been like as a little girl.
And we had a lot of support from the police officers. We had a visit to the Old Bailey beforehand, so we could see the court environment and that sort of thing. And it was very, very. It was awful, and there was, quite honestly, nowhere for us to turn. I went. The other person, I don't feel, has ever actually dealt with it properly.
Okay.
I had to, because it was just continuing, and it was having a dreadful effect on my whole life. And I was lucky enough that my mum paid for me to have some therapy to work through it. And ultimately, I was able to forgive the person. He's dead now. I never actually told him that I forgave him, but for me to move on, I needed to.
Sure.
But yeah, as a 10-year-old, I didn't want to we had a very difficult family situation. I didn't want to make it worse.
And I don't need you to go into details about that. I think everyone can recognise the sort of scenarios in which a 10-year-old can persuade herself that she's doing the right thing by not, as you say, making things worse. What about as you got older? Is it like a room you tried to never visit? Because you mentioned the impact it had upon you and the effect it had on you. So someone who's never been close to going through what you went through, listening to you now, Helen, might sort of think, but surely as you got older, the door got looser. Do you know what I mean? That it was harder and harder to keep a lid on things, and that the desire to speak out and go to the authorities, or indeed to confront your abuser, would have got greater as you got older. But I wonder whether actually it just becomes a nagging constant presence rather than an escalating one.
It was a nagging constant presence, and it was I felt anxious all the time, or frequently, about the other person, and obviously responsible. And it just never went away until I was in a very bad way after the court, and I had therapy, and that was when I began to heal. And I'm very happily married. I have an 11-year-old son, so you can learn to live with it. You can get over these things. You can move on. But I don't believe that you can do it on your own. And
not until it's out in the open.
No.
How interesting. And how completely and horribly believable that is. And you know, an old friend of mine, Helen, wrote an article for an Irish newspaper about how some of the priests that taught him had favourites, and it would occasionally involve hands down trousers and that sort of thing. And he wrote about how it didn't do him any harm. And I've always thought, I bet it did, mate. I bet it did. And until you recognise that it has, and until you confront the fact that it did happen, you will just suffer in this weird self-imposed silence. Helen, I'm a little late for the news, but thank you so much for calling in. And I have to tell you now that we're not going to be able to talk to everybody who has, but that we will talk to as many as possible. But I'm not going to hurry people up on a subject like this. You know why.
James O'Brien on LBC.
25 minutes to 1, 2 or 3 emails, then back to the phones. You'll work out what we're talking about and why my voice sounds so cowed. Stayed silent because I had no idea how wrong it was, James. Also, the lady threatened to tell my mum and dad that she'd caught me smoking. I didn't smoke. I was 7 or 8 and just thought that the adult would be believed. I told my best friend once and swore him to secrecy. He had also been abused by someone different and swore me to secrecy in return. When I told my wife, she struggled with it and once in an argument screamed at me that this abuse was the source of problems in our marriage. My 10-year-old heard, and then I had to discuss it in full with her. That's probably the only good thing that came out of the whole business. That's from M. This is unsigned. It's kept quiet because of the shame on the family, and the people said that other children would take the mickey, so tell nobody. I can't tell you my name, James. It's a constant pain in your heart that never goes away. You just learn to live with it. And Emma, who puts her name with characteristic courage on the end of her message, writes, you can bar that door all you like. The miasma still hovers. Sometimes that door bursts open with no prior warning, a reminder, a smell, a touch of a certain pressure, and you're back there again, powerless and terrified. It's important to understand why such a tiny proportion of people who endure child sex abuse come forward. And it's important not to judge the people that didn't, which is why we're talking to them today. Suzanne's in Enfield. Suzanne, what would you like to say?
Hello.
Hi.
I did go to... It was my grandfather that abused me when I was 3 years old.
Oh.
It's my first memory that I have. He must have said to me, don't tell anybody, because I told my mum, which was her father.
Yeah.
I guess I told her because he told me don't tell anyone, and she's always told me if somebody tells you that, you must always tell me.
Yeah.
She didn't really do anything other than never leave me on my own again with him, which obviously stopped the abuse. However...
She believed you, but she...
It was all a secret.
God.
It was swept under the carpet. I told my dad, I kept running away a lot when I was 15, 16, probably because I didn't... She took me to see a counsellor who actually said, I think probably you've got trust issues with your mum because you feel that, you know, she didn't protect you.
No kidding, absolutely.
I said to my mum after we came out of the session what was said, and she said, no, this woman's putting things into your head. So I never went to see the counsellor ever again. I told my dad when I was about 15, 14, because he wanted to know why I hate my mum so much and I keep running away.
Yeah.
And when I told him, she said, oh, well, thanks a lot. And she convinced him that it's not how I remembered. I was only 3. He didn't do the things that I...
Do you understand why? You must have given this a lot of thought. Do you understand what was motivating her?
I don't know. I try and bring it up to her. Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right.
I try and bring it up with her.
It would be right now, wouldn't it, Rachel?
She even now, if I approach the situation, she still is in denial of it all. It didn't happen how I said it happened. I don't know whether it has happened to her.
Oh, of course.
She's not going to tell me that. He did it to my sister as well, which she doesn't know about.
Right.
Which makes me think, I wonder if he did it to her as well. I don't know. Or I don't know how I would cope if somebody said my dad had done that to my daughter. I don't know. I think that I know how I would respond. But
you
that's
don't know
where
till you're there. It's very easy, isn't it, to be confident of how you'd conduct yourself in a certain circumstance that you've never been in. But once you're in it, you find out what you're really going to do. Did you report it? Did you ever go beyond the family? Did you ever report it to the authorities?
No, because he actually... I've got a lot of trust issues with men, with anybody probably. Inevitably, I've been in and out of abusive relationships. I've been in prison a couple of times. I do think that it all stems down to this.
Yeah.
I've been and tried to get help again, but now it's almost like it's done. I've he's dead. There's nothing that can be done about it. I've got to learn to live with it and try and not let it ruin the rest of my life.
Do you still see your mum?
Yeah, because when I went to prison, she had my child from the age of 18 months. So she still has her now. There's no social services involved. There's no qualm of I cannot or I can't see her. It was due to the circumstances they took her on. Whether she took her on out of guilt for not protecting me at such a young age, I don't know. However, I'd go up and see her because she has my daughter. I don't think I would if that wasn't the case.
No, I understand that.
It's probably helped me forgive her a little bit, the fact that she's taken on my daughter. But, even when I speak to my dad, they just shut me down even now.
What, but even your dad as well?
My dad, yeah, they're still together.
Sure.
My mum was convinced my dad that it wasn't how I remember it.
That's the thing I think those of us on the outside find the hardest to understand. And actually, I got another email from someone very similar to you who did come forward when she was older. Also someone who ran away a lot. Then she reached her mid-20s and got back in touch with her parents, who she'd run away from. Dad jumped up and left the house to go and visit him, her abuser. Mum said, "Now look what you've done."
Yeah, this is the reason my mum said to me, I wouldn't have told your dad, is because he would have killed him, and then your dad would have been in prison, your granddad would have been dead. It's a horrible, and it's an awful thing to grow up with it and not have help, and have the help too late, because you kind of learn to live with it, and you've
But you can never trust anyone again.
No. And I do have a lot of problems. Now I'm married. I haven't been to prison for 4 years. I haven't been to prison. I'm in a full-time job. I'm married. I've got 2 more children. But I am very hypersensitive around them. I won't let them stay out. I won't,
I bet you are. I bet you are. But you're talking about it. And for years you didn't. And that's got to be progress.
Exactly. But that's because today I can. If I'd have heard this next week, when a day where I couldn't talk about it, because there are days I can, and there are days that I just shut everything out.
And there are plenty of people listening to you now who are having one of those days where they can't, and I can tell you for sure, because they're telling me that it really, really helps. Emma's back in touch. Thank you. Shaking. It's not brave, it's anger. It's kept in the dark by monsters. Rip down the curtains. Sunlight disinfects. And that's why we carry on doing what we're doing. Rachel, thank you so much. I think we've already spoken to Suzanne, haven't we? I think. I beg your pardon, that was Suzanne. Rachel is on the line now. They're both in Enfield, that's why I got confused. Rachel, hello.
Hi.
What would you like to say?
Basically, my experience with child abuse came where I was dating a boyfriend, and he's now my ex, because I found out that he was abusing his child. So instinctively, I reported it immediately to the police. It caused a lot of havoc in my life. I had to move from where I was. Sorry, I'm a little bit nervous.
Hey, take your time.
My first time.
Of course.
I moved from where I lived. I had to change a lot of things about my life. It was really I was very angry at the time, and I think it was my anger that drove me to just do the right thing. The most important thing I wanted to say, or the reason why I called, is the message to everyone who may be in a situation of knowing what's going on. You might have a bit of short-term discomfort, but
yes.
Literally what you do for a child, she was only 6, and it went to the police. it's all in the police hands at the moment. But for me, my temporary discomfort and knowing that I can sleep at night and I did the right thing, and knowing that the little girl, wherever she is, at least someone spoke up for her.
Someone believed her. Do you know, I wasn't sure where you were going with your call, with your conversation, but of course it's a huge part of why people don't do what they know to be right, because the disruption it visits upon your own existence, especially if it's your partner, as it was with you, it tears everything up. Everything's off. Yeah. But as you say, you can start rebuilding again. You can start regrouping.
And a young child doesn't have that opportunity, especially if it goes on into adulthood and they carry it along with them. And the fact that,
like Suzanne, who we heard before, and I think it's a proportion of people who were abused as children in prison is huge, and yet it just never really gets talked about. These strange sort of conversations that we have about rehabilitation, when in fact these are people who are dealing with problems the rest of us can't begin to imagine. Are you in a better place now? Are you?
I am. I mean, I've sort of put my life together. It happened a year ago, so it's still quite fresh.
Yes.
Obviously, it's not easy starting all over again. Everything that I had, I left it because I literally had to be on the run.
God, and that is, I mean, such a helpful call as well, because a little different from the others that we've spoken to, very different, being the person who made the report. But I'd overlooked that fact. So imagine if it was your husband or your wife or your boyfriend or your girlfriend right now, and to go forward with that accusation, to do what was right for that little girl. You lose your home, you lose your social circle, you might lose your family, you could lose everything to do what's right, which explains, not excuses, why so many people don't. Omar writes, after 22 years I came head-to-head with my abuser. I kept it from my family and often cried myself to sleep, but it all came out into the open when I got into a fight with him at a family wedding, and I felt free, James, as he was older now and I was stronger. Sean in Brighton writes, thank you, James. Please revisit this subject. God willing, I will find the courage to talk to you next time. And this from Bob. Hello. Hello, Bob. I'm a regular listener, but do not have the courage to speak on air. For a 63-year-old man to cry on the radio will never do. I was abused over a number of years by my so-called father. My mother was a lovely lady, but had no control in the home. We lived in Chelsea, and my mother worked in the Home Office, and my father drove limousines for so-called VIPs. I've said enough, I think. I couldn't talk to my mother about it, or anybody else, but I'm sure she knew, because she was made to visit a doctor who, incidentally, was also a family friend, and consequently was placed in a mental institution, and I spent more time under the stairs in the broom cupboard. My mother was released eventually, but she was a changed woman, and she eventually ran away with my 2 brothers and myself when I was 5 years old, and we lived in council housing until her death. Needless to say, it has never left me, and the only person to come close to making me tell all was my wife. But she died in March of this year, and one of the things she said to me before she went was, tell someone. This is the closest I've ever come to doing so, James. Please keep up the good work. Jane's in Essex. Jane, what would you like to say?
I'm very nervous at this moment in time, Jane.
Of course you are. Take your time.
My stepfather abused me from when I was about 8. And I never told anybody because he told me at the time if I ever told my mum, she'd never believe me. And she'd put me into care. And I believed him. Yeah. For all my life, I believed him.
You were a little girl. Of course you did. He was a grown-up. You believed him. It's what little children do.
And he tortures me every day. I eventually told my mum after he died, and she believed me, and she cried. We sat at the table and she cried for me, and she told me she was sorry, and I told her it wasn't her fault. It was just something that was awful in my life. And I tried to put it in a little box and lock it away. But today when I heard you talking about it again, as I have in the past, and I thought today I'm going to be brave, make the phone call and tell somebody else how bad it makes you feel. I didn't let it destroy my life. I've got married and I've got 2 amazing children that are protected with all my might.
Of course.
And always told them from being small, don't ever never tell me anything. Always tell me if anybody ever touches you where they shouldn't touch you, because it just leaves you vulnerable to the world.
Knowledge is power, isn't it? And you had no knowledge when you were little, and your children got knowledge from you that you were in a position to give them.
It's just every day, those, the little box might open itself up and all these horrible memories come back and they swamp you and make you feel bad on the inside because it's like it's your fault. Why was I picked? Why did he feel the need to invade my space, and to leave me like this today, all these years on?
I do, and I know how
it's so hard
desperately
to cope with it sometimes.
Of course it is, but you're looking for answers to questions that should never even be asked. You were a little girl. The only reason it happened and the only person responsible for it was him. The answer to all your questions is him. You were just desperately unlucky to have such a monster coming into your life. There's nothing you did to make it happen, nothing you did to, God forbid, encourage it, nothing you did to feel responsible for. You just had a monster in your life.
In later life, it wasn't. When I told my mum, she then told me that apparently one of my sisters, she had a friend that was in a children's home, and apparently he'd interfered with her at some point on a visit. But when she went back to the children's home, she was disbelieved. They said she had a very imaginative imagination, and she was never allowed to visit again. But I just thought it was true.
Yes.
But because I was so afraid that my mum seriously would abandon me.
Well, this is what they do, and that this is how they find their victims as well, isn't it? By looking at the people who can be frightened into silence. But you're not being silent now, Jane. You're not being silent now.
No, I don't. I've found, and my heart stopped pounding now. My heart was pounding.
I could hear it. I think I could hear it.
I just feel, I don't know. I needed to
talk
today. I needed to talk to somebody and to tell somebody.
Well, you know what Emma said in that text. She said you got to tear down the curtains. It's kept in the dark by monsters. Rip down the curtains. She wrote, sunlight disinfects, and you've just brought a little bit of sunlight. Might not feel like it now, but you get it out there. Be open. Talk about it.
Somebody else is listening, and they have the courage to tell somebody else to make their life a little bit better. That's what I hope.
Well,
because you are right, it's not your fault, and I suppose you have to accept that. And I've always thought, what did I do wrong?
Nothing.
What did I do that made him do such terrible things to me?
And for you, then, it's a cold and sort of miserable statistic that only 1 in 8 cases ever comes to light, but it's something you find all too easy to believe.
It is, yeah, it is. It's took me a long time to get to this point. As much as it torments me, because it does torment me a lot.
Sure.
I think today was just, it's raining and I was just driving along and I thought today I'm going to build the courage up and I'm going to make the phone call. So I really didn't think she'd call me back.
Well, we did, and I'm very glad we did. You sound like a lovely woman. I hope you don't mind me saying that. I'm so glad.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much. You're why we do these conversations, just to bring a bit of light into these dark corners and hopefully reduce the number of corners all around. Jane, you take care of yourself. I'm sorry. You've got 60 seconds left. I'm not going to speak to anybody else because these stories do not lend themselves to neat encapsulations. I will apologise, though, to Julie, who's waiting to talk, to Gavin, to Sue, to Jackie, to Lisa, to Leslie and to Poppy, and to everybody who's been in touch via text and email. You all suggest that we return to this as soon as possible. We will, I promise you. We haven't done it for a while. I think that the distraction thrown up by the VIP scandals has drawn our attention away, and I'm a little embarrassed to recognise and realise this, away from the massive majority of abuse, which, as the Children's Commissioner reminds us today, doesn't unfold in luxury flats in Dolphin Square or in secret corridors, in the corridors of power. It unfolds in sitting rooms and bedrooms right across the land, in houses like ours and our neighbours and our friends. And I guess that's part of the reason we look away so violently, because it's so close to home we'd rather not think about it. But we have to. And Jane, I think, just explained in words I could never find why we have to.